Hey everybody, Playtendoguy here, and I'm back with another video. Today, as I'm recording this, it's May the 4th, which is May the 4th be with you, Star Wars Day. So I thought, what better time is it to do a Star Wars centric video? I thought, shall I do a Blu-ray collection of Star Wars? Shall I do a ranking of the films? And I thought, no, let's do something a little bit different and do a video game collection. And with the recent release of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, I think this is a perfect time to do it. I have about 18 games ranging from the DS, the Wii, the PS4, so there's a lot to get through. So without further ado, let's get into it. I was always a big fan of the Star Wars games. Definitely the ones where you play as a Jedi wielding a lightsaber. They've always been a lot of fun and always been my favourite sort of Star Wars games. And back when I was a kid, Star Wars games were 2 a penny. You used to get hordes of them. There used to be multiple ones a year. Then when Disney bought Star Wars, it pretty much dried up. And then it started to slowly trickle out a little bit more, mainly thanks to EA in the past few years. And now actually we are actually having a bit of a Star Wars resurgence in video games. Over the past 4 to 5 years, we've had quite a substantial amount of titles, whether it's remasters of old games or new ones being released by EA, and there's also quite a few more to come from other different video game developers. But enough waffling, let's dive right into things and talk about the Star Wars games I do have in my collection. So first up, I'm going to try and start it off in like console order, but it's not going to be in release order. First up, I do have an American, I don't know how I ended up getting it, but an American copy of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I can remember when this film came out and I was a massive fan of it, still am now. I think it's the best of the prequel trilogy. And this is a cracking little game. It's very much a side-scrolling beat-em-up with the story of the Revenge of the Sith in the background. You can play as either Anakin or Obi-Wan and go through their story path, go to different levels and different boss fights. It's not the most complex game in the world, and it is essentially the GBA game just been ported over to this. Though you do get some like Star Fox 3D space battles, which are pretty cool. Overall, it's one of the best Star Wars DS games out there, and highly recommended to pick it up. It's actually probably better than the PS2 version. Star Wars Lethal Alliance. I can remember when this came out. I think this came out in 2006, and it's a very weird game. It also came out for PSP. You play as one of these species of characters. I cannot remember what they are. I think Ahsoka's. I'm not well versed in Star Wars mythology, but you play as this character, and it's like a third-person action adventure shooter. It's not a bad little game. It's pretty basic, but still quite a fun time. I remember picking this one up real cheap on eBay for about £3 brand new, and I had a solid little fun time with it. Nothing special, but still a fun little oddity in the Star Wars franchise that you don't see much of these days. Next up is one called Star Wars The Clone Wars Jedi Alliance. And this is based on the Star Wars The Clone Wars TV series, which I've only ever seen a few episodes of, but I liked what I saw. This one's set in the events of the first season or even the film, and it's an entirely touch-based adventure. You use the DS touchscreen to solve puzzles, get into combat, and the presentation of this game is actually really quite good. For a DS game, it has like a really cool cel-shaded visuals. There's even voice acting in this one, which quite surprised me. Granted, it's not very good, but still, for a DS game, this was really impressive. It's very basic in its gameplay mechanics, and it's quite glitchy at times, and there's some really, really long, unskippable cutscenes, which are a pain in the backside. But again, I picked this one really cheap up, and it's a fun little game. They did a sequel to it, but I heard it was pretty rubbish, so I never got it. So that's Star Wars The Clone Wars Jedi Alliance. And I remember they did one for the Wii as well, and that was just lightsaber duels, but I never played that one. Next up is probably my favourite Star Wars game of all time, but this is the DS version, and that's Star Wars The Force Unleashed. I remember when this came out in 2008, and I was absolutely hyped for this game on the Wii. But a few years ago, I decided to pick up a brand new copy of this on DS to see what it was like, because back in the day they used to do like 20 different versions of the same game, and each game on different systems were all different. And this one's an entirely touch screen affair. You use all your lightsaber attacks on the touch screen. It's a very short game, only taking about 2 or 3 hours, but it does its own thing. It tries to mirror the big budget versions, but doesn't do it totally well. It's not huge open areas, it's very linear, but it's still pretty fun. Some great boss battles. Not the most complex game, pretty much a lot of these aren't, but still a fun time, and you do get some pretty good recreations of those big boss battles that you get on the home console versions. So Star Wars The Force Unleashed. They did bring out the sequel on DS, but I never played it because I heard it was awful, and that's only about an hour to complete, so I never even went there. And this is probably arguably the best Star Wars game on the DS, and this is Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron. This is more like a strategy game where you control like stormtroopers as you go through these like Diablo style levels. It's a top-down shooter, but it's a fun little time. There's some brilliant space battles here straight out of Star Fox, and they're a lot of fun. The gameplay is again very basic and repetitive, but it has that usual Star Wars gloss over it to make it quite an enjoyable time. This one also came out on the PSP as well, which was in gameplay wise to the Battlefront games, I think. So that is Elite Squadron. And this was the last Star Wars Battlefront game for like 6 or 7 years until we got it for the PS4. So yeah. The Nintendo 3DS side, and this one proves how odd these Star Wars games get. I picked this one up again super cheap, brand new online, and it is Angry Birds Star Wars. Anything got the Star Wars treatment back in the day, and Angry Birds was one of them. It's the typical Angry Birds gameplay with a little Star Wars twist on them. Each character has their own special like force powers or special abilities like blasters or the force or even lightsabers. It's pretty good. It's Angry Birds. You know what you're getting. I remember when this one came out on PS4, it was like 50 quid, and this is only like a £2 or £3 phone game. But I didn't pay too much for it. It's a fun little game, nothing special, but that's Angry Birds Star Wars, and you don't get no instructions with them now. Most of these games, once you get to the PS4, instructions are a thing of the past. Next up, we have 2 Star Wars Wii games, and we have my favourite Star Wars game of all time. This recently did get a remaster on the Switch, and I'm hoping and praying for a physical release of it. And that's Star Wars The Force Unleashed. I got this for my birthday back in 2008, and this is such a brilliant Star Wars game. It's a Star Wars power fantasy, it is. You play as Starkiller, Darth Vader's secret apprentice. So you go around slaying Jedi and also pretty much defeating anybody in your path. You have all the brilliant Star Wars force powers like the lightning, the choke, being able to throw your enemies all over the place. It is a great fun time, and I don't think no other Star Wars game has ever been quite the power fantasy as this one has. The story on this one is absolutely fantastic. It won an award, I can remember, and they also did a novelisation of it. It's a really good story. You do feel for the characters involved, and it's a shame that it's not really official Star Wars canon now since Disney bought the rights. I'd love to see a TV series or even a film starring Sam Witwerth as Starkiller. I think it would be brilliant. It's definitely better than most stories that Disney have told since they've acquired Star Wars. So inside you do get artwork, and you do get some lovely artwork on the disc. It's a bit weird me talking about video games in this sort of fashion that I do like a Blu-ray pickup video in, but I'm quite liking it. And the final Star Wars Wii game is the sequel to it, Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2, and this is the biggest pile of cack I've ever played. I remember when this one came out, I was really hyped for it, and the reviews were absolutely abhorrent for it. I picked it up super cheap for about a £5 a couple of years after release, and I played it. It's fine. The story is awful. It basically undoes every brilliant thing they did with the first game. and did a basic, bland, boring story with unimaginative gameplay. And whilst it was still a fun Star Wars power fantasy, you cannot beat that original game. That was superb. And this game was super short, took only about 4 hours to complete, if that. Mind you, this one was only about 6 to 7 hours to complete, but I must have played through this game about 10 times. And I honestly really hope we get a Switch physical copy of it, because it did come out digitally on Switch last year. Please, if you're watching developers, bring it to Switch physically. Next up, we'll talk about the Star Wars PS4 games. And we do have a nice little box set one here for Lego Star Wars, The Force Awakens. I remember watching Star Wars The Force Awakens first and really enjoyed that one. And when I saw there was a game of it, I picked it up straight away. And this is a fun Lego game. It's a Lego game. You know what you're expecting here. It doesn't reinvent the formula. It's just going through different levels based on scenarios from the story, from the film, with that same sort of Lego humour. You've got voice acting in this one, which is great. And it does justice to it. It does stretch things a little bit too thin. Like segments of the film that are like only about a minute or two end up being like an hour level. It is a bit daft. But we did get a Lego Star Wars game a little bit later on that did remedy that a bit. But very enjoyable game, quite glitchy, I can remember that, but a lot of these Lego games are. And you also do get, if I haven't undone it, a cool little minifigure of Finn there. And you do get your game with instructions as well, which is a surprise for a PS4 game. I think this one came out in 2016, but that's Lego Star Wars The Force Awakens Special Edition as well. They acquired the rights to Star Wars, they closed down LucasArts and sourced out other companies to make Star Wars games, and one of them was everybody's favourite developer and publisher, EA. Yep, that didn't end well. Well, it's a bit of a bittersweet story. A lot of up and downs, but we're currently on a high with them at the moment. But it started off in 2015 with Star Wars Battlefront. This one came out in perfect time for the release of The Force Awakens, and boy can you tell, it was no single player mode in it, and it was very basic maps. It was just multiplayer Star Wars, something similar line of Call of Duty. And whilst it looked glorious and ran perfectly well, it was a very soulless game with not much content, and it was pretty much a one and done sort of game. After a few matches, you've pretty much seen it all, played it all, and there wasn't really much love for Star Wars in it, which is a shame because it would have been lovely if they did go all the way out. But I haven't played it in quite a while, but it's still a solid, if unremarkable, Star Wars game. And 2 years later, in 2017, we finally got the sequel to Battlefront 2, though that arrived with its own level of controversy in Star Wars Battlefront 2. When this game released, it had everything fans wanted: more maps, more characters, and a single-player story mode. Unfortunately, it was jam-packed full to the rafters of microtransactions and loot boxes, which were common practice at that time and still is now. So if you want to unlock Darth Vader or one of the many iconic characters, you'd had to fork out the money for it. And again, it was all down to luck. You could earn it through good old-fashioned gameplay, but apparently it would took about 40 to 50 hours to unlock one character. So yes, it didn't go down very well with gamers, and it actually caught the eye of governments across the world, which cracked down on this game, and I think it pretty much did get took offline for a little while to rebalance the online economy. Thankfully, the developers, DICE and EA, listened and they fixed the game, and now it's a quality little Star Wars shooter. Whilst again it doesn't set the world alight with its online shooter mechanics, still a fun little Star Wars trip, and the single player mode is actually really quite good. All the characters are unlocked, and there was a bevy of free updates for it. They certainly made up for it in the end, but at launch it was a bit of a mess, but now it's definitely one of the better Star Wars games of the past few years. The final Star Wars. This was the final Star Wars game before next gen PS5 came with EA. And I'm pretty certain this is the last EA Star Wars game they did for PS4. And that is Star Wars Squadrons, which is developed by EA Motive, and it can be played in VR, but I don't have a VR headset, so I just played it normally. And it's a Star Wars spaceship shooting game, similar to the line of sort of Star Fox. I played quite a bit of this one, and you know what? It's pretty underrated. Not a lot of people talk about this one at all. It does feel quite strategic in its combat, and you can play online dogfights, which was something a lot of people wanted from the Star Wars Battlefront games, but never really got it. This one really felt like it scratched an itch really well. You had a solid single player campaign, really good multiplayer mode, and the best thing about it was this was a budget release. This was only 30 quid, which was brilliant at the time. I don't think it set the tills alight, unfortunately, and wasn't a huge seller, but it was still a quality little Star Wars game. Hopefully this is a sign of more things to come from EA, more smaller budget Star Wars games that tackle different parts of the galaxy. And the final game for the PS4 is easily their best work to date. Developed by Titanfall developer Respawn Entertainment, it's Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. The single player Star Wars game fans have been craving for since EA took over. The game is a mishmash of all different types of big budget games from Metroid Prime, Tomb Raider, Dark Souls and a bit of Uncharted to make a sort of Frankenstein Star Wars game that is brilliant. The story isn't the greatest, and the leading character, Cal, was a bit of a blank slate, to be fair, but the characters around him were pretty likeable, and it didn't rely too much on Star Wars nostalgia to tell a pretty decent Star Wars story. The combat feels like a bit like Dark Souls Light, and it was accessible enough for everybody to enjoy. The game did suffer from quite a few technical issues at launch, mainly due to feeling like probably it should have been the game for the PS5. But thankfully with updates it runs a little bit better now, and it does have a free upgrade to the PS5 where you can play it, and it's pretty much runs perfectly. It's a lengthy game as well, and it feels like a proper third-person action Star Wars game that fans have been craving for since Star Wars The Force Unleashed. So it's a solid game, and if you haven't played it, it's highly recommended. We have a small selection of Switch games as well. We have Star Wars Pinball. Yes, Star Wars Pinball pretty much says what it is on the tin. A selection of pinball tables, all based on Star Wars, the movies, TV shows, all sorts. Really fun little game. Nothing too special. It's Star Wars Pinball, but it does have a lot of content there with like mission modes and online leaderboards. It's a quality little game, and again, it doesn't set you back too much. Only about a tenner it cost me. Last year we received one of the best Star Wars games of all time, and probably the best LEGO Star Wars game, and that's the Skywalker Saga. I picked this one up on the Switch, and whilst it's technically not as impressive as the other console versions, it still features the whole game here. You can do explorations of all different planets. You've got all 9 films well represented here, hundreds of characters and different vehicles. And whilst the levels aren't as complex or lengthy as the ones in like The Force Awakens and previous LEGO Star Wars games, they kind of feel a bit more like bite-sized chunks. They're still really fun and well represented of Star Wars as a whole. It's a true celebration of the series, and it does feel like it's the best LEGO Star Wars game out there, and there's nothing really more that they can do now. There's also been like a load of DLC for it as well with like extra characters. It's definitely one of the best Star Wars games out there currently, and that's LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. And on the Switch's digital shop, they've released loads of older Star Wars games from like the early 2000s and ported them onto the Switch with new graphics in, so they run a bit better. And they did release these physically, and these were super cheap. So we have Star Wars, the Racer and Commando combo, which includes Star Wars Racer and Republic Commander. Star Wars Racer takes the pod racing from episode 1 and evolves it into a full game. It's really enjoyable, great soundtrack, and quite a lot of content in it. It's a Nintendo 64 game, just been up-res. It does look a bit rough, shall I say, but it runs perfectly. Republic Commander's a first-person shooter, and you play as like one of these Republic Commando troops as you go through different levels, shooting out all sorts of various nasties. It's a fun game. It's quite difficult, which surprised me. And unfortunately, the performance on the Switch isn't the greatest. But this double pack is well worth picking up if you're a Star Wars fan and you want a bit of nostalgia. Next up is Star Wars Jedi Knight Collection, which includes Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, and Jedi Knight Jedi Academy. A lot of Jedi. I played bits and pieces of these two. I did actually have a digital copy of Jedi Knight 2, and that's a really solid Star Wars Jedi adventure. It is quite difficult, and the controls are a bit antiquated compared to like modern Star Wars games. Jedi Knight also has online multiplayer, which is pretty cool, but unfortunately I've never had the chance to check it out because whenever I try to get into a match it never works. But they feel like more of the same. This one actually kind of feels a bit like DLC. But again, I haven't played too much of this one, but this is a quality one. And the final game in my Star Wars video game collection is actually the newest one. And yes, you've guessed it, it's Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Recently come out less than a week ago. I'm currently playing through it now, and it's a great game. There is a few technical issues with it, a few glitches here and there, and the frame rate isn't the greatest. But underneath those small technical issues is a brilliant Star Wars game. It's a huge evolution over Fallen Order. The combat here is snappier, more brutal. The world is more expansive, and the story is really captivating as well. I'm only still in the opening hours of this game, but so far I'm having an absolute blast with it. So that's Star Wars Jedi Survivor. And if you're a big Star Wars fan and have a PS5 or the new Xbox, I'd highly recommend giving this a go, as it's a superb Star Wars game. So there you have it. That's my complete Star Wars video game collection. Something a little bit different from a Star Wars film ranking and film collection. And this doesn't even scratch the surface of many different Star Wars games out there. There's even been a Star Wars Kinect game where you can dance as Han Solo. There's so many different games from a galaxy far, far away, and this is just a small smidgen of the games available. What games do you have in the Star Wars universe? Tell me all in the comments section down below. What were some of your favourites? What were some of the bad ones? There's been quite a few. Tell me all in the comment section down below, and I'll get back to you, I promise, and we'll have a good discussion about all things Star Wars. So thank you ever so much for taking the time for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. You stay safe, and I'll see you all on the next video. Bye.